This is Jason Lindamood with the Lindamood Law Firm, and I want to talk briefly about the current laws guiding the step-up tax basis of inherited property, and as well as where we currently are with the proposed changes to the laws that may eliminate the step-up basis provision, which really would be a tremendously big deal that I think a lot of us realize and understand. And the way the wind blows on this issue seems to change every couple of weeks, doesn't it? With factors like the 2022 elections coming up next year, as I'm filming this in the fall of 2021, as well as how, for lack of a better term, risk-averse Congress may be in terms of pushing that proposed legislation through at the moment, as we are here this year with once again the elections coming up next year. But let's define our terms, even though I know many of you have a well-grounded understanding of how the basis step-up works. And to do that, let me use a quick example to illustrate this point and how it may affect us. I think this is probably the best way I could do it. And I wish I had a whiteboard or a PowerPoint presentation, because I think I'm a visual guy, I'm a visual learner. So I'm going to try to do this verbally, and hopefully in your mind's eye this makes sense to you guys. But you probably already know this, so I'm just going to regurgitate what you probably already know and rehash it and go over it once again. But let's say that your dad acquired property many years ago, and he paid $10,000 for it, right? And dad passed away and left it to you in a will, and it's now worth $500,000. Because it was left to you as an inheritance as opposed to a gift while dad was alive, you would acquire a tax basis based on the property's current value. So, even though dad only paid $10,000 for it originally, you wouldn't be required to pay capital gains taxes, which is really the crux of the matter here. That's what the crux of this video is about. You wouldn't be required to pay capital gains on the $490,000 in appreciated value that the property has enjoyed. Because remember, dad paid 10 grand for it. He died, we inherited it, it's worth $500,000. The difference between 10 grand and 500 grand, $490,000, right? So instead, under the current laws, you inherit the current value of the property, which in this example, and remember we're saying it's worth $500,000 again, as a stepped up tax basis for capital gains purposes. So if you were to sell it while it's still worth $500,000, you wouldn't be required to pay any capital gains taxes at all. And let's say you were to hold on to it for an extra couple of years. You were to hold on to it for a while, and you ended up selling it a few years later for, say, $800,000. Then your capital gain would be the difference between your $500,000 stepped up basis and the $800,000 value from when you sold it. So you'd have an increase of $300,000 from your acquired basis, which would then be taxable at the appropriate capital gains tax rate. So there's a huge distinction there, big distinction there. Instead of paying capital gains on the difference between the original $10,000 purchase, and if we're saying that the current value in this hypothetical is now $800,000, we're only going to be paying capital gains tax on the difference between our inherited stepped up basis of $500,000 and the $800,000 we were able to sell it for. And I think most of us would agree that paying capital gains on 300 grand is much better than paying capital gains on $790,000 based on our example. Again, dad pays 10 grand for it. If we don't have an acquired stepped up basis, we inherit it at $500,000 value, and a few years later, because we hold on to it, it increases in value. The market goes up to 800 grand. Then once we sell it, that's a taxable event, and that $790,000 is going to be the basis by which the appropriate capital gains taxes are going to be employed upon. So this is a huge deal when we're talking about inherited property or inheriting property from someone, and the inception of our tax basis being the value of the property from when we inherit it, rather than what our loved one actually paid for it many years ago when it was much cheaper. So acquiring inherited property with a built-in stepped-up basis eliminates us from paying any taxes on it at the time of death when we acquire it, since we step into its current value. And that makes common sense, and this has been well-settled law for a long time. And some of the language in the proposed changes that Congress is or has been considering in the last few months that I've been keeping tabs on is considering including creating a taxable event, which has never really been done before at the time that the property is transferred, which includes whether it's by gift or by inheritance. So it includes inheritance, which means that under our example of the property being currently worth $500,000 at the time of death, we'd have to pay tax on that fair market value. And the unique thing is that under these proposals, once again, there's a taxable event being created, yet unlike most transactions that trigger capital gains taxes, there's been no cash creation in order to absorb that tax debt. So it's effectively changing the nature of the stepped up basis that we've once again operated under up to this point for so many years. So we inherit a property worth $500,000, and if new legislation triggers a tax bill on that, then we have a couple of choices. We either have to come up with the money to pay the taxes on it if we want to keep the property, if we want to keep it in the family. Dad dies, we inherit the property. We either have to come up with some money to pay the tax then and there, or we simply sell the property and move on with life. And neither option is great under these proposals. And as an aside, the current long-term capital gains tax rate is 20%, and there's a proposed increase to, I believe, 25%. So not only would more value of any inherited property be taxable, but it would also be taxable at a higher rate as well, which is another thing. So the last thing for me today, there are a couple of exceptions about tax triggering events that are floating around, and I'll mention them really quickly. They include transfers between spouses. That would be exempt under the current proposals that I've been hearing about, as well as transfers to a revocable living trust that would also be exempt. Transfers and gifts to charities would be exempt as well, I believe. The last one I can think of is or regards transfers of any tangible personal property that isn't business related. That would also be exempt. So those are some of the exceptions attached to some of the proposed legislation that is floating around that hasn't been ruled upon or voted upon or enacted as of yet. So to sum up, this can be a big deal depending on how the legislation gets crafted and ultimately what gets passed by Congress and what gets signed into law by the president. But if the step-up basis of inherited property is effectively eliminated, it's going to markedly change how we attempt to keep everything in the family and avoid taxable events in ways that we really, to be quite blunt, haven't had to do up to this point. So it's something to keep an eye on. And that's all I have for you today. Once again, this is Jason Lindamood with the Lindamood Law Firm. If you are in a place to hit a like button, or if you can share this video with somebody that you think may want to hear it, even though it's sort of a wonky video and it's not the most exciting thing in the world to talk about it, but if you know somebody that wants to hear it, please share it with them. Or if you feel led to leave a comment, that's always greatly appreciated by me, and I'll thank you in advance. And if you have any estate planning questions, any wills questions, any questions about trusts, or any probate questions, and you'd like to discuss them, head on over to estateplaninfo.com. That's estateplaninfo.com. That'll take you directly to my firm's website where you can call and schedule a time for you and I to speak. So as always, thank you for your time, thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.